This is Green-White Delirium, and this is a deck that is not a major contender in Standard right now, but we do know that Black-Green Delirium is one of the top decks, so why not try a different version of Delirium, and that's what we see here. This is my list that I've been playing with, and I'm excited to show it off on Magic Online here. So, 2-color mana base, we've got, as you would expect, Canopy Vista, Fortified Village, and then we've got some forests. The plains are a little bit more of a splash, so only 2 plains versus more of an emphasis on having the green mana early. Evolving Wilds is very important in this deck. We've got Tireless Tracker, but we want a bunch of ways to find our waste. So you'll see at the bottom the unusual copies of waste. There's 4 copies of waste, the 6th basic land, and you can search for it with Evolving Wilds. You can search for it with Traverse the Ulvenwald. So there are a number of ways to have it, and then on turn 2, if you have it in play, then you can Ruin in their wake, and you can use that as a rampant growth. So this deck is a Delirium deck, but it's also a ramp deck. So it's able to get a lot of mana very quickly, and that's something different than the black-green deck. So looking past the mana base, we've got Traverse the Ulvenwald. We know how powerful this card is when you can enable Delirium, and it's also important, as I mentioned earlier, to find that waste so that we have it for turn 2. And there aren't that many creatures in the deck, but we want to be able to play Silver Bullets like Emrakul the Promised End, and playing 4 copies of Traverse allows us to do that. Vessel of Nascency, it's our best way to get Delirium online quickly. And beyond that, it finds a lot of our important cards. So like a card like Quarantine Field, which we see as one of our late game plays, we can find off Vessel of Nascency. We can do a lot off of Vessel of Nascency, and there's not that many Delirium enablers in the green and white colors, so we are relying on it a reasonable amount. And at our 2 mana slot, we've got Servant of the Conduit as our creature, and this is basically an additional mana ramp card. So Servant of the Conduit, it's vulnerable to removal, and we're also not an energy deck, so I don't like playing 4 of them. We'd much rather play Ruin in their wake with a waste out on turn 2 most games than play Servant, but Servant is a backup play. And Ruin in their wake, you can use it as a rampant growth, but you can also put that land in your hand if either you don't have a waste in play, or you would rather actually get a land into your hand and then put it into play untapped on that turn. So sometimes you'll see that situation where you have waste in play, but yet you want to Ruin in their wake just to essentially get a basic into your hand. And we see that the transition from 2 to 4 is pretty important, so we've got a lot of 2 mana ramp effects to get to 4 mana faster. So as it turns out, playing a turn 3 Gideon is pretty strong. So we can play turn 3 Gideon Ally of Zendikar, which is also, it's nice to have Planeswalkers in our deck because we want them for Delirium. So there's a reason why we have enchantments, we've got artifacts, we've got all of the different card types that we could possibly want. And Gideon is a turn 3 play that can just win us the game. It could steal us a game where we don't really need to do much else. We've also got a 3-drop that isn't necessarily really a 3-drop here. It's Tireless Tracker. I don't like to play Tracker on 3 because then your opponent can just kill it and you haven't gotten any value off of it. You really want to play it, then play a land, and best case scenario, it's Evolving Wilds, and so then you get some clues which you can use even if your opponent then uses a removal spell to get rid of the tracker. But our 4 mana card is actually Hedron Archive. So we see these spatial contortions hanging out there, And we've got 4 copies of Waste, which we can find very easily, as I mentioned earlier. So Spatial Contortion is our early removal spell that we can play, and we've got colorless sources to support it. We can play it on turn 2. We can also play it on turn 4, so we can go Hedron Archive into Spatial Contortion your guy, which is a pretty strong play, and that can happen on turn 3, with an Archive being cast on turn 3. And Spatial Contortion, it kills a lot of the more annoying creatures in this format. Cards like Spell Queller, Grim Flayers, early stuff that we really want to be able to get off the table. And even something like a Selfless Spirit, it's not going to protect you from Spatial Contortion or a card like Descend Upon the Sinful. So Descend Upon the Sinful is basically the White Delirium card in this deck. This is not a card we see much of in Standard, but it's very good right now. The Exile effect makes it a lot better than Fumigate, and you can get the 4/4 White Angel to go along with it. So you'll see this card be able to just steal a game from the opponent. Cards like Scroungers and Amalgams, and against the Black-Green Delirium deck, where you can descend and they can no longer Liliana back their creatures or grapple back their creatures because you've exiled them. And so that part of the card is very important. And there's 2 copies of Descend Upon the Sinful, and it's been extremely impressive. We can play it pretty early. Normally you get to the point where you can cast it in the game, and you can ramp up to it. So there's not that many creatures in the deck, so you're not normally sweeping away cards of your own that are super important. You try to play it before something like a World Breaker or Emrakul if you can. There's also Nissa as another big play here. The ultimate is very powerful. It can take over the game, especially with the ramp stuff. You can and Evolving Wilds, you can draw like 3 cards a turn with it. Or sometimes you just go 5/5/5, you're dead. So it's another win condition here. And then, of course, we've got the Spider, Ishkana. So any Delirium deck, any Delirium deck in Standard should just have Ishkana in it. So we've got 2 copies here, just because we can't hit Delirium quite as easily as Black-Green, so you don't really want to draw multiples, and then sometimes you don't have Delirium, but it's a good card. You can, of course, traverse for it, but we don't have black mana other than Servant of the Conduit, so the activation doesn't come up that often in this deck. Even then, it's still just a great card. And then we've got some of our big plays here. So Quarantine Field, it's actually a card that a lot of the times we want to wait till later in the game. We'll have played a Hedron Archive. We'll have a bunch of mana, and then we can exile like 3 or 4 permanents of our opponents and really just wreck their entire board. It's also just a very versatile card. So there's a lot of niche decks, niche cards in the format, various enchantments, various artifacts that you might want to Quarantine Field, and it's versatile. And once again, we're able to exile whatever the permanent is. So it's been pretty impressive overall, and it's a mana sink. So we've got so much mana ramp that we really want a mana sink, like a Quarantine Field. We've also got Emrakul, the Promised End, of course, as a one-of. It's important for any type of Delirium deck. Because we've got Traverses, we can afford to play only 1. And then the 2 copies of World Breaker. World Breaker is a card that is quite good right now. I like it in a lot of matchups. There's Gearhulks running around. There's Scroungers. There's Stasis Snares. There's so many different cards beyond just lands that you want to blow up, exile. And then beyond that, if you mill it with something like a Vessel of Nascency, then just having it in your graveyard is nice. You can always sacrifice a land, bring it back, and get some more value off of it. So World Breaker is, in many ways, even more important than Emrakul in this deck. But of course, the one Emrakul still ends up winning a lot of games. But I like them both quite a bit. And the sideboard, it shores up some of the deck's weaknesses. So sometimes the aggressive decks, if they have a good start, game 1, you're busy ramping while they're curving out with creatures. That sometimes doesn't work out the best, but we've got some removal spells here. So Natural State, it kills cards like Smuggler's Copter, Stasis Snares, Key to the Cities, whatever we really want as far as cheap artifacts and enchantments. Declaration in Stone, pretty straightforward, 2-mana removal spell. And we've also got Stasis Snares here. We've got Blessed Alliance. So we're really going to be able to load up on spot removal spells against aggressive decks like Vehicles or Red-Black Aggro. Plummet is for blue-white flash. They just have flyers that you want to be able to kill in the most efficient way possible, and Plummet allows you to do that. And because that deck is so popular, you can afford to spend 2 slots on just the best card for the matchup, which happens to be Plummet. And then Servant of the Conduit, I like it as part of a sideboard plan to board into bigger spells. So if we're boarding in, as we see here, Thought Knots in Nissas, we want to be able to ramp into them. Turn 3 Thought Knot, it's pretty powerful. So Servant of the Conduit helps us to do that. And we can board in more creatures. A lot of times your opponent will board out a lot of their spot removal against you because we don't play that many creatures in our deck. So we've got Thought Knot, which it comes in a lot of matchups, especially on the play post board, and it does quite a bit of work. And Linvala, I like it against Blue-White Flash and also against the aggressive decks. And then Nissa, it's more for the control matchups, and it can be, in those matchups, extremely impressive. So this is the list as it is right now.